everyone, and welcome back, and we are indeed so freaking back to Commander in General, where in general, we talk about Commander. You already know why we're here. The good plane and the bad plane have mashed together to give us this brand new set of Lorwyn Eclipsed, which is kind of like the year 2026 so far. Like, on the good side of things, it feels so good to be back and making deck techs again. And with such a fantastic set, I could not be happier. But on the evil side of things, current news events, not that you can trust the news anymore, it seems. My cat had to get 10 teeth removed, and my car broke down on the literal second day of the year. None of that's even a joke. But luckily, the only place I need to be right now is here on YouTube for your Commander-loving enjoyment. And I truly am happy to be back because, oh my god, I am loving this set. Awesome mechanics, drop-dead gorgeous art, and two very sweet Commander decks, including the star of today's show, your sweet Auntie Ool. This card is busted, and I'm going to show you just how and why this card provides so much incredible value after I ask you to provide some incredible value of your own by leaving a like on this video if you enjoy this kind of content. It super helps the channel, and also subscribing if you want more deck techs just like this one, or a deck tech for Ashling the Limitless, which you will also find on my channel. Alright, we're gonna get right into this deck tech, but as we go, make sure you let me know what you think of some of these spicy picks down in the comments, and also let me know what awesome cards that I missed. The entire deck can be found on my Architect page in the comments. But enough of that. So let's get ourselves Sch-OOLED on the ultimate, the ultra-violent Cursewretch herself, Auntie Ool. Let's get started with a little Blight reading. Auntie Ool is a 4-mana 4/4 that's 1 and Jund for a Goblin Warlock whose text box reads firstly, Ward. Blight 2. For the uninitiated, Blight is one of several keywords, old and new, that we will find in Lorwyn Eclipsed. Basically, it means that the person who is being blighted has to put X amount of negative counters somewhere on their side of the field. Call that counterproductive. So if a creature you're playing has Blight 2, you would put 2 counters on something you control, but because this is a ward ability, it's opponents that are attempting to target them who will have to, which does work out nicely to disincentivize some removal. And doubly so when we consider the second half of their text box, which reads, whenever one or more -1/1 counters are put on a creature, draw a card if you control that creature. If you don't, its controller loses 1 life. Well, holy smokes, getting to draw a card whenever a negative counter befalls one of our creatures? Well, well, draw our whole deck then. Okay, enough jokes, let's be serious. That ability is crazy. It's going to be an engine that provides us with the gas to make our deck run, and also help us drain out our opponents as we diminish down their boards. It leads us to what to me is a very appealing strategy. On our side of the board, we run what is sort of an unconventional Aristocrats-like build, where instead of sacrificing our creatures, we use negative counters to get them in the graveyard, all the while drawing a ton of cards. And on our opponent's side, the negative counters work both offensively by diminishing their life totals and their board state, and defensively by decreasing their potential damage output and disincentivizing attacks. So on top of all of that, and being a negative counter deck that can finally play both the Scarab God and Hapatra in the same place, this build is going to lead us to play tons of cards that I'm sure you, and definitely I, have never played before, and you know I love that. So let's start with that pseudo-aristocratic element that is going to be the backbone of how we win this game. So of course, you can always default to your regular Blood Artist, since you'll port Cutthroat type cards that are your prototypical draining pieces, but we've also got Bastion of Remembrance, which also makes us a 1/1 token, which is just ripe for the reaping, and the brand new Grave Venerations, which is a 4-mana black enchantment that adds in one of my favorite mechanics, Monarch. And it says that when it comes in, you become the Monarch. At the beginning of your end step, if you're still the Monarch, return up to 1 target creature from your graveyard to your hand. When a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. This is an all-timer for me personally, but we don't have to just drain our opponents on our creature's way out. We can also do it on their way in with cards like Impact Tremors and Perforos. Obelisk Spider mimics Ool themselves by draining whenever we put a negative counter onto a creature, on top of placing a counter themselves when they deal damage to a creature, which, as a 1/4 reacher, can be a pretty decent blocker. And similarly, the enchantment All Will Be One says that whenever we put 1 or more counters onto a permanent or player, it deals that that much damage to target opponent, creature an opponent controls, or planeswalker an opponent controls. This can just help us ping someone out, or can act like some removal, especially for some of that smaller stuff. We're also going to play lots of creatures that are really capable of taking a beating. Creatures that we can just kill over and over and bring back turn after turn. Cards like Bloodghast, which comes back on landfall, Nether Trader, which comes back for a single mana whenever another creature dies, Cult Conscript, Reassembling Skeleton, and Timeline Color, which also can be played from the yard for a smidgen of mana, Forsaken Miner, which can be replayed from the yard whenever we commit some sort of crime, like, I don't know, placing a negative counter on something. And an interesting one here, Mosswood Dread Knight, which can be played as an adventure from your graveyard, which will draw you a card and lose you 1 life, but then of course after their adventure, they can once again be played as a regular creature. With the amount of these self-recurring creatures in our deck, I don't think it's an awful idea either to toss in a few graveyard tutors like Burning Rune Demon, Corpse Connoisseur, and Buried Alive, which also just let us search our library for a few pieces and just hawk them straight into the bin, and then can be played all the same. Now, all of those are really easy to get back and play from the yard, but one really cool category of creature for us in this deck you would think would be persist creatures, because they put negative counters on themselves. But even better than persist is undying creatures. So simple creatures like Butcher Ghoul and Young Wolf are really simple low to the ground creatures that we can just put counters on over and over again and can really be abused for Aristocrat triggers. So persist creatures say that if they don't have negative counters on them, they come back when they die. But undying creatures say that if they don't have positive counters on them, they come back. And if you didn't know, negative and positive counters cancel each other out. But importantly, before this happens, Auntie Ool does see that negative counter go on that creature. And if we're willing to pay a bit more mana and put a few more counters on it between playing it and it hitting the grave, Gleeful Arsonist is an undying human wizard who will also deal damage to our opponents whenever they play a non-creature spell. So it's going to help us chip down those life totals in more ways than one. And while Mikaeus the Unhallowed doesn't have undying themselves, they do give all of our other non-human creatures that we control undying, which can let us pull all sorts of other shenanigans. Now there is one thing we're going to need to be careful of here. If, let's say, Young Wolf already has died once and they have a positive counter on them, if instead of 2 instances of negative counters being put on them, we instead have a single effect that says place 2 negative counters on that creature, this will cause 2 state-based actions to trigger at the same time. One that says that the negative and the positive counters need to get rid of each other, and one that says this creature's toughness is below 0. Because of the way state-based actions work, both will resolve at the same time, and our creature will hit the yard with both negative and positive counters on them. Because of this, the Undying won't trigger because they still technically have a +1 counter on them, and they'll stay in the graveyard rather than coming back. So just be wary of that specific scenario. Also, Auntie Ool doesn't care about multiple counters hitting that creature at the same time. They only care about an instance of negative counters hitting that creature, so really this is kind of how we want to be playing anyway. The last option we have here for disposable creatures in another sense is tokens. You can instead play cards like Hepatra, Nest of Scarabs, Flourishing Defenses, along with Eumidian Hatchery to stack up some tokens as we stack up some counters. But anyways, those are our red suit Trekkies, the ones that are just gonna die over and over and over again. But honestly, they aren't gonna be the only ones, because next up is a slew of creatures that on ETB are going to help, among other things, populate our own board and our opponent's board with an onslaught of negative counters. Now, like I mentioned, Auntie Ool sees 1 instance of her ability no matter how many negative counters are being put onto a creature at a single time. However, they do see an instance for each individual creature that a negative counter is being put on. So a card like Soul Snuffers is an absolutely heinous bomb for just 4 mana. In the Magical Christmas Land version of this play, you're playing against 3 token decks and everyone just takes 1,000,000 damage. But even if everyone just has a few creatures on board, it's still going to come down, diminish your opponent's boards, deal some damage, and draw you some cards on top of that. And coming out with this deck, we get a similar version of this card in Village Pillagers, which deals 1 damage to all creatures your opponents control on ETB, but they also have Wither, meaning that they deal damage in the form of negative counters. Now, this doesn't place counters on your own creatures, so it isn't going to draw you any cards, but what it is going to do is it also says that you get a tapped treasure token whenever a creature with a counter on it dies. Carnifex Demon comes in in with 2 negative counters on it, which importantly, because of rule 122.6, Auntie Ool does actually see this as a trigger to start with, but then they can remove a counter from themselves and put one onto each other creature. So once again, we see this ability to sweepingly place a bunch of counters. Bait and Whip Punisher is similar, but they can sack themselves to destroy a creature with a negative counter. Spitting Dilophosaurus places a counter on ETB as well, but also stipulates that creatures your opponents control with negative counters on them can't block, which even if we aren't attacking much, opens them up as better targets for our opponents. Kolrath Knight has a very similar effect, but it also says that they can't attack if we are trying to turtle in and just put our walls up here. The brand new Reaper King No More also does this, but steals our opponent's creatures when they die with negative counters on them. We can do this once each turn. And similarly, Necroskitter is a 3-mana Wither creature with the same ability, but does not say only once per turn. Dreadtiller, another new Scarecrow, also places a negative counter when they enter, but also they say that when a creature with said counter on it dies, you may put a land card from your hand or graveyard onto the battlefield tap, which can ramp us and also make extra good use of those fetch lands. And Orc Surshot gives all of our creatures this ability, since it places a negative counter on our opponent's creatures whenever we play a creature. And on top of all of those ETB creatures, we've got a few more here to bolster our negative counter output. That would also be a good joke if Bolster was a negative counter ability, not a positive counter ability, but don't worry about it. Firstly, it should go without saying that many of the cards with Blight in the main set go great here, such as Gristle Glutton, which blights you while letting you rummage, Scuzzback Scrounger, which blights you on your main phase and gives you a treasure, and Bogslither's Embrace, which is a 2-mana sorcery that says as an additional cost, you can either blight 1 or pay 3 to exile a creature. But we've got tons of other options for negative counters besides this set, such as Persistent Constrictor, which on each opponent's upkeep will lose them 1 life and you will get to place a negative counter. And on top of that, they have Persist. Blowfly Infestation lets us place a counter whenever a creature with a negative counter on it dies, including our own, which is fantastic. The Scorpion God lets us trade some extra mana for negative counters, recurs himself, and will draw us a card whenever a creature with a negative counter on it dies, mimicking Auntie Ool herself. And lastly, an all-timer and all-arounder, Yawgmoth lets us trade 1 life and 1 creature to place a counter and draw a card. And on top of that, lets us discard a card and pay a couple black mana to proliferate as well. And we've already talked about it, but putting counters on a bunch of your opponent's creatures all at once counts as a whole lot of triggers, so proliferation is a major asset, and a big component of us being able to end the game out. So cards like Contagion Clasp, Contagion Engine, Evolution Sage, and Karn's Bastion lift well above their weight class for us here. I also don't mind Nesting Grounds here, which lets us pay a single mana to move a counter from something we own to something else, which can be really versatile. Now, a really cool thing about this deck is that we have several parts of our strategy that we can bake our card draw and ramp into. Like for instance, in our card draw, in the realm of counter synergy, we have some newer pieces like the brand new Sinister Gnarlbark, which simply says at the beginning of our end step, draw a card and blight 1. In essence, this is going to be drawing us 2 cards when our commander's out. There is Hollowmurk Siege from Tarkir Dragonstorm, which is an enchantment with 2 modes, the Sultai mode, which lets us draw a card once each turn when a creature gets a counter, or the Abzan mode, which gives attacking creatures menace and a 1/1 counter every time we attack. Generous Patron comes in and places a few counters of their own, but they also draw us a card whenever we put a counter onto a creature we don't control. And lastly, possibly one of my favorite new cards in this whole set, just because of how stupid it is, Oft-Nabbed Goat. This is a 2-mana 0/5 that firstly has an ability that says pay 1, draw a card, and gain control of this creature, and put a negative counter on it. Only opponents may activate this ability, and only as a sorcery. They go on to say that when this creature dies, if it had 1 or more negative counters on it, its owner draws that many cards, and each player loses that much life. So it's this fun game of pass the goat, everyone's drawing cards, But more importantly, no matter what happens really, you are either going to deal damage or draw a card whenever this little guy gets stolen. But foregoing counters, we can also draw lots of cards off of death triggers, like with Village Rites as a one-time instant. We can draw a couple of cards at the cost of a creature. Morbid Opportunist and Death Reap Ritual can draw us a card if a creature dies, and Massacre Girl can draw us even more than that, with the stipulation being it needs to die with toughness below 0. So basically we need to kill it with negative counters. On the ramp side of things, yes, you can can't go wrong with the classic ramp rocks, and of course we're in green, so that avenue is open to you as well. But we do have some more interesting options here this time around, like with Devoted Druid, which can tap for mana, but place a negative counter on themselves to untap. And oppositely, Channeler Initiate enters with the negative counters on it already, and we can take them off to add 1 mana. So of the two, this is probably the one that we can make last a little longer. Wickersmith Tools is a cool new rock that, yes, lets us make 1 of any color, but it also gets a charge counter whenever we put a negative counter on a creature. Later on, we can pay 5 mana, tap it, sack it, and create X amount of 2/2 scarecrows equal to the amount of counters on it. So a pretty big bomb later in the game, actually. I do think that having some decent recursion for a couple of our non-self-recurring pieces is going to be the last big piece of the puzzle for us to keep this engine churning. So one-off cards like Unnatural Restoration and Vat Emergence are fantastic because of that extra proliferation clause we're talking about earlier, as well as Persist and Rise of the Witch King as those last pieces of one-off recursion. But as for recursive recursion, I'm always a big fan of Phyrexian Reclamation, and Chainer is a graveyard all-star, but a new one from this precon that I do really love is Puka's Covenant, which is an enchantment that says whenever a creature you control with a counter on it dies, you may return another target permanent card with mana value less than or equal to the number of counters on that creature from your graveyard to your hand. Do this once each turn, which for some of those 3 mana, 2 mana, and 1 mana cost creatures, this could really give us that last little push to keep the ball rolling and our board state strong. Now, of course, with our negative counter strategy, a lot of what we're trying to do in the first place could be constituted as some low and slow removal, but you can never be too careful. And also, we just have some incredible options such as Atomize, which destroys any non-land permanent and then proliferates, Wickerbow Elder, which also comes in with some negative counters, and then those counters can be removed to take out artifacts or enchantments, so if this sticks around, we could really blow a lot up. Cankerbloom also destroys artifacts and enchantments, but also has that other mode in a pinch that we can use to proliferate, and Lethal Sting destroys a creature at the additional cost of placing a negative counter on our creature. Oh no, whatever shall we do? Crumbling Ashes lets us destroy a creature with a negative counter on it on each of our upkeeps, but fair warning, this is not a May ability, so if you are the only one left with a creature with negative counters on it, you will be forced to destroy something, which once again, with all the aristocratic elements we've got going on here, you may not mind. And lastly, Black Sun Zenith is no doubt the best board wipe for us in this deck, since it works in terms of negative counters, and Maha, its Feathers Knight, is not only an awesome flying beater, but it turns each of our opponent's creatures to base toughness 1, making it so that each and every negative counter is a one-hit kill. But that is it, folks. I hope you've enjoyed this one. Before you click off this video, please do not forget to like it. I'll also have another deck tech on my channel for Ashling the Limitless, so you do not want to miss that. If you like deck techs like this, consider sticking around a while and hitting that subscribe button. And don't forget to tell me down in the comments what you liked, what you didn't like, which cards that I missed, and lastly, that whole deck list is down in the description for you on Arcadeck. We are so close to that 5K subscriber mark, where we will be celebrating by opening this set booster of Commander Masters, so please tell your friends that love this game just as much as you do. This has been Commander in General. I love you all, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.